The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote, "Life is hard, at times as hard as crucible steel. It has its bleak and difficult moments. Like the ever-flowing waters of the river, life has its moments of drought and its moments of flood. Like the ever-changing cycle of the seasons, life has the soothing warmth of its summers and the piercing chill of its winters. And if one holds on, one discovers that God walks with him and that God is able to lift you from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope and transform dark and desolate valleys into sunlit paths of inner peace." The day after the New Year's morning attack on Bourbon Street, the mayor and some city and law enforcement officials held a prayer circle at the site of the attack, laid 14 yellow roses, one for each person killed. And then a band led a second line down the street into the quarter, officially reopening the street after the police work there was done. That pattern derives from the New Orleans jazz funeral tradition. A full-scale jazz funeral is, of course, much more elaborate, but it takes the same crucial turn from solemnity to celebration. This is what my colleague, the Reverend Melanie Morrell-Ensminger, a native New Orleanian, taught me about that tradition. The New Orleans jazz funeral tradition began to develop in the early 19th century, combining European and uniquely American musical elements with a distinctively African spiritual sensibility. It begins on the night before the funeral with a wake, where folks would sit up all night long with the body, singing and sharing stories of their deceased loved one. Sharing stories is healing. Recalling and sharing stories in community helps us lay down the burdens of grief and memory. Keeping pain inside is isolating. Sharing pain connects, liberates, and heals. After the wake, the funeral, the coffin would be removed from the home and carried slowly with great dignity through the streets of the city to the church. The brass band follows behind the hearse in slow lockstep, playing mournful dirges, with the family and friends behind them all moving slowly and sadly, doing what in New Orleans is called the slow drag, in time with the music. The people following the band are called the second line because the band is the first line. At the church, the funeral service would follow the traditions of that church. And after the funeral service, the coffin would be carried from the church to the neighborhood cemetery for burial. Even today in the old neighborhoods, small cemeteries lie scattered throughout residential areas, some of them now considered historic, as the tradition continues to bury the dead in the community where they lived. Again, they process from the church to the burial ground, in line and second line behind the hearse. At the gates of the cemetery comes the ritual known as cutting the body loose. This is the crucial turn I mentioned. As the coffin is placed into the burial vault, the Grand Marshal of the band lifts his baton and gives the signal that the body has been dismissed. The band switches tempo. Slow and sad dirges give way to hot swinging dance numbers, happy and bright. The second line of mourners and well-wishers break into clapping and dancing and singing along. Often, if not always, among the tunes the band plays is "When the Saints Come Marching In." Here is the cornerstone of African spiritual practice upon which the jazz funeral is built. Acceptance of the fullness of life. That life is full of sorrow and joy, pain and pleasure. The acknowledgement that all these are parts of the whole of life. The dead are dead and we are alive. And in our living, our joy and pleasure and hope for a better future. This is the deep wisdom that the New Orleans jazz funeral tradition preserves and teaches, and that in my experience, New Orleanians live. When I heard about that moment of honoring the dead and then striking up the band to open the street, it conjured the whole tradition and spirit of the jazz funeral in my mind and heart, as it would for anyone, native or like me, fully naturalized to New Orleans. The band and the second line is not just a party. It's a ritual of sacred joy that implicitly acknowledges all of life that is not joy. The sorrows and disappointments, the hardships and losses, the threats and the struggles. And it lifts up joy and love and community as sacred because they strengthen us and carry us through from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope, transforming dark and desolate valleys into sunlit paths of inner peace. On this day, and especially tomorrow, let us cut the body loose and embrace the love and joy we have in community together, remembering this one additional quote by Howard Thurman: "Long live life."